Imagine the situation. A new edition of whatever your favourite game is has been released, or maybe your army just got a new codex, and you're going through it and, hold on, I gave all my Space Marines macro mega death guns and they're not here anymore. And my captain with power feet has been removed. And now you can't even make them ride badgers? Why? Why do all the options seem to change every time there's a codex? And why do some get removed that used to be there, messing up your models? Well, let's find out. Get more arbiting at Arbitorian's Precinct House with Book Club and Tale of Four Gamers, link below. So, as I write this video, the Warhammer Horus Heresy community has had a predictably calm and measured week because a load of units and options were cut from the game. Well, actually, that's not quite what happened. In the run-up to Horus Heresy 3rd edition being released, Games Workshop posted on Warcom that, don't worry, no one's army should be invalidated by these changes, and also that while the units present in the army lists would change, there would be a free Legacies PDF coming out, and then, despite that, when the Libers, which are the army lists, went up for pre-order, and when leaks happened, and then when official reviewers confirmed that loads of units were missing from them, the entire Heresy community collectively lost their minds. For about a week, everything was wrong. Every one of their armies had been destroyed. And this lasted for about a week until the Legacies PDF content list was released. It's out next week as I write this. And it replaces almost all of those missing things. So, the usual calm and measured response from a hobby community. But some things did change. A few options did get removed. And then other things have moved from a published book to a free PDF for some reason. And this sort of thing has been happening for years across all Games Workshop products. So why? Why in every edition do they remove options from the main books when they never used to? Old Games Workshop games deliberately included more units and war gear options than were ever produced as models. So what changed? Well, settle in, because it's a story that takes about 20 years to play out, involving angry fans, like every story in Warhammer, legal battles, and starting with the core of the entire hobby: how you manufacture models. Throughout the 1990s, there was a standard way of producing Games Workshop models. Models came in two materials, either plastic or metal. Metal was the traditional material used, since it's pretty easy to make a mold and easy to cast in small numbers. Historically, all toy soldiers like this were made in metal. First lead, and then an alloy referred to as white metal. And by the 90s in Warhammer, most individual models, leaders, or specially equipped models, the sort of things you wouldn't be buying many of, were still made like that. Plastic is a bit different. Plastic injection molding machines are a lot more expensive, and the tool, the sort of mold used for plastic models, is a lot more expensive to design and make. But once you've done that, producing each sprue is much cheaper. Essentially, plastic models require a lot more investment up front, which means they were reserved for things that would definitely sell a lot. Most armies had a few plastic units, maybe a plastic vehicle or two. They were the sort of things that everyone's army would probably include, so the company would definitely sell enough to make back that initial investment. And that led to a big part of how Warhammer looks, the idea that a lot of models are just another model with an extra thing added. If you wanted to sell a Space Marine artillery vehicle, then the most efficient way to do that was to take the existing fully plastic tank kit, the Rhino, and then sell it alongside some additional metal bits that turn it into, say, a Whirlwind. Loads of units in Warhammer have plastic base models and then some additional metal bits that turn them into something else. And the lore had this whole idea about STC systems, which is a way of supporting that in world. That's why everything looks like it's made from the same basic objects. One of the advantages of this was a very flexible bits system. All of these metal parts were made individually, and the warehouse staff would go down the row of bins, little bins of las cannons or heads or wings, and pick all the stuff required for a box of models. This kit needs 3 plastic bike sprues, 1 melter gun torso, 1 plasma gun torso, and 1 sergeant torso. And since all the bins were right there, Games Workshop could sell the bits too. In the early days of the internet, Games Workshop ran a bit store on their website. You could order whichever metal bits you wanted, and they'd pick them on site and just send them to you in a box. Occasionally, entire plastic sprues would show up, usually for much smaller things like glass canopies or maybe a bike. But they didn't allow ordering individual plastic bits. As you can imagine, that would take way longer for every order and would probably leave them with a load of half-used sprues full of all the bits no one needs right now. I built loads of armies this way. My Emperor's Children army has a ton of original metal bits that I just bought in one big order in about 2004 or something. It was really useful because the codexes often featured whole units or combinations of equipment that they didn't make as models. The designers just added them because they either represented a model from years ago or, they just felt like a cool option. So there were whole units in the codexes that just never really got models, but they kept printing rules to them every edition. And that wasn't assumed to be a promise that they would one day make it. It was just a cool idea that you could kit bash or convert up if you wanted. Even if Games Workshop were never going to make a model for these things, no one was losing anything by having the option anyway. And for a few years, it didn't run for very long, that bit service was a really useful way of getting the parts you needed to build those options. However, during the 2000s, the company as a whole and the game evolved in a few different ways, which shifted how this system was seen both by fans and by the company. First, Games Workshop started to grow quite a lot worldwide, particularly in North America, where it mostly grew in the same comic book shops and game stores that Magic the Gathering had already established a presence. And that, combined with the rise of online forums and people talking about the game a lot more, resulted in a bit of a shift towards a more competitive mode of play, especially in games like 40k, and a much greater focus on the game compared to the models. And at the same time, this expansion saw Games Workshop move to a much more plastic-based product. Metal has a lot more volatile price, it's also much heavier to ship. So they expanded production and released plastic kits for all new units, and those sprues included things that would have previously been metal extras. Also, many of the completely metal character models they made, they transitioned to some form of resin. Forge World continued making resin conversion kits for a while, designed to add on to plastic models. In fact, they still do that, but resin parts tend to come on small sprues with multiple bits on them. So, with the removal of the metal range, Games Workshop stopped their bit service. It wasn't really around for that long, and they still produced and sold on the website some little packs of plastic bits, usually stuff that came on its own sprue anyway, like jump packs, but the bespoke pick your own service went away. I've never worked at Games Workshop. I don't know what the reason for that was, but I would guess that with the number of orders a modern Games Workshop were getting, combined with an all-plastic range, the bit service would have been a much bigger operation to try and keep running. Even if you sold just the sprues as line items, that's still hundreds of extra items to keep in stock and to produce and keep track of for probably a small proportion of the fan base who were buying bits. Anyway, however small it was, that created a demand. And the first people to capitalize on that were bit sites. People realized that you could charge a massively inflated price for the popular bits, and then they could offset that against the fact that no one wanted the rest of the sprue. But this wasn't the player's preferred solution. If you actually go and look at posts from that time, the general tone is that Games Workshop putting options in the codex that aren't on the plastic sprue is bad. Wrong. In fact, it's a conspiracy to get people to buy more kits so they can have the most meta option. A Devastator squad can take 5 heavy weapons. The box includes 1 of each, but right now, taking all las cannons is optimal, and Games Workshop won't sell me that, which is a deliberate conspiracy to force me to buy 4 boxes just to have the best unit. Games Workshop shouldn't be putting options in the book that they aren't willing to sell me. A few things probably led to this attitude developing, partly the removal of the bit site, but this is kind of the era when players started to declare they would never touch anything other than plastic, so how much of an issue that was, I'm not sure. Partly it's a new player base, a much bigger player base, who saw this hobby primarily as a gaming one more than a modelling one, where building the most optimal army was the entire point, and they wanted to do that without any extra work. They thought, well, if there's an option in there and it makes my army better, why don't they sell it? And the solution they wanted was one where Games Workshop either reintroduce a plastic bit service, which as we said is probably quite unlikely, or just put more in each box, which is also unlikely. The actual cost of just making another sprue, say more heavy weapon sprues in the Devastator box, is very, very low in terms of plastic, but it's much more expensive in terms of logistics at scale. Going from just a 2 sprue set to a 3 sprue set means 50% more time on the machines to make one kit, which means that to keep up production levels, you'd need 50% more machines and floor space and staff and infrastructure for that. And the finished box would have to be a bit bigger, so it would take up, say, 50% more space, which means fewer boxes per pallet. So your warehousing and internal transport costs all go up 50% too. Even nowadays, when kits have a lot more parts packed onto the sprue, it's mostly the same number of sprues. It's just that modern design allows more stuff to be packed in. Logistics at scale is a massive consideration for a manufacturing company that big. What's more likely was the other solution to this problem. If players hate being given options they can't buy, you could always remove the options. But we're still in the late 2000s here, and that didn't happen either. Games Workshop just carried on doing what they were doing. They gave more options in the books than they could fit in the kit. Converters like me were fine with it. Gamers complained. And that was it. What changed things was another development of that 2000s expansion. With the advent of online stores and the ease of setting up a small garage business, a lot of small third-party sellers started to pop up on the internet. People sculpting and casting their own toy soldiers and selling them, sometimes as an independent studio, but also often just from their home. Many of these sculptors were Warhammer players, and they sculpted their own Warhammer parts, alternate heads and shoulder pads and replacement weapons, even sometimes alternate sculpts for units Games Workshop made. This industry had grown and had figured out ways of operating, but many of the parts they were making were quite clearly designs based off Games Workshop products, which led to a wave of legal action by the company, alleging that people were stealing their designs. But none of this really made a lot of difference until these claims were properly tested in court. In 2010, Games Workshop took legal action against Chapter House Studios, a small American company founded by a couple of Warhammer fans who made the usual range of conversion bits, heads, and sometimes whole models for Warhammer factions, filling a niche they felt Games Workshop didn't cover. In fact, unlike most third-party bits companies, they actually advertised their products using Games Workshop naming conventions. Bits for Space Marines rather than generic Gothic Knightly Warriors or something. Games Workshop made over 100 claims against Chapter House, ranging from them copying their IP, copying their visual designs, copying their models, to them using recognised trademarks of Games Workshop without permission. And unlike many other companies, Chapter House decided to fight this, and so the legal case went on for almost 4 years. It was resolved in 2014. And how you think this went and who you thought was at fault here varied within the community. On one hand, there were plenty of people who thought Chapter House from the start were playing with fire. In many jurisdictions, companies are required to legally protect their trademarks and copyrights or lose them. Deciding not to take action when someone copies your stuff can be seen as admission that you don't care about it or don't own it. And Chapter House were definitely copying Warhammer designs and advertising that using Warhammer product names. So they probably should have seen it coming, right? Many of Games Workshop's claims did eventually stick, some trademark stuff, and particularly the idea that some of Chapter House's models were variations, just like a female variant of a model Games Workshop already produced, which was considered to be copying them in some way. On the other hand, plenty of people sided with Chapter House. Games Workshop were bullying a small company whose only business was selling the fans additional parts and options that Games Workshop didn't sell anyway. And besides, we all know that Warhammer's influenced by lots of other properties and historical events, so it's hypocritical for them to sue someone for being influenced by Warhammer, right? And the majority of Games Workshop's claims didn't stand. Many were refused, especially really simple ones. Pauldrons, for example, were considered too basic a shape to claim as copyrights. I'm not a lawyer, and this story really isn't about the legal details or even who was right or wrong. It's about what happened afterwards. In the end, Games Workshop spent loads of money on lawyers. Chapter House were represented pro bono, and Games Workshop had most of their claims refused. But Chapter House did have to pay a small settlement, and Chapter House shut its doors anyway. They'd had to cease so many items as that case played out that the company had been driven into the ground. Games Workshop did shut down their competitor, in a sense, but the case actually revealed two great big liabilities. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so bear with me for my terrible descriptions here, but there were two big concerns that came out of the case that would be concerns really for any large company. First, a large amount of the terms Games Workshop were using and considered theirs were in fact not enforceable as trademarks. Space Marine was just too generic and had been used elsewhere, as was Imperial Guard or Stormtrooper or pretty much anything in Warhammer Fantasy. A lot of the names they had given to their Warhammer products offered them no trademark protection. Anyone could use those names. And then second, and bear with me as I try and get this right because it's the most important one. While artwork and descriptions of Warhammer warriors and Warhammer units were owned by the people who drew or wrote them, that ownership didn't extend to any model that was made based off of that artwork or description. The model had its own copyright as a separate thing. So if Games Workshop described or depicted a specific model with a specific weapon, but they didn't make the model, someone else could. Essentially, model designs are their own thing, and if Games Workshop don't make the model, then the third party aren't copying anything. That's the most important bit, and if I've got the terminology wrong, I'm sure lawyers can do it properly in the comments. As a company who were increasingly in this era finding that their main product was their IP, and who already had thousands of descriptions and depictions of models they didn't make floating around out there, all called stuff that it turned out couldn't be trademarked, well, you can see how this might set off some alarms in any large company, right? Now, those were the liabilities that were raised as a result of the case, and it is of course up to the company as to how they're going to react to that, what policies they will choose to put in place to mitigate that risk. At the point of this decision, Games Workshop had thousands of model kits in production with long shelf lives, thousands of pieces of art they'd already made, hundreds of books full of unit descriptions, many of which did not exist in model form and weren't available, and then they're balancing any change they might make with how disruptive it would be to the customers or to the business. So it's not like anything would change overnight or even change at all. They could always decide that certain risks are negligible and they don't need any action. They could implement certain policies for bigger properties, but not do it for smaller properties, for example. And it's also likely whatever policies they put in place would change over the next few years. We're talking about a decision reached in 2014 here. But I think we can look at what's happened since then and track many of the changes in Warhammer back to this point. In 2015, Warhammer Fantasy Battles was replaced by Age of Sigmar. I don't think that's because of this case. Warhammer Fantasy Battles was selling terribly, but it's notable that with the new game, these decisions seem to have been taken into account. Units tended to have fewer options, and they only had the options that came in the model kit. And all the naming convention shifted. Armies, and sometimes units, were given more unique names. So Orc instead of Orc, or Elves instead of Elves. And a couple of years later, the same policies seem to have been tracked through to Warhammer 40k in 8th edition, which, like Age of Sigmar, had a goal of simplifying and streamlining the game to attract new players. Most new units had fewer weapon options, and the new rules pretty much only covered the stuff that came in the box, and of course names were changed, so Imperial Guard became Astra Militarum, Stormtroopers became Tempestus Scions, and Space Marines started to be referred to as Adeptus Astartes a lot more. And of course that's been the trend for about a decade now. Publishing rules for units with options that they don't sell is a liability, and so they limit heavily where and how often they do it. And of course, the options we get when a new book comes out are subject to other policies too. They generally want games to be most accessible to new players because that's the majority of their business. So they don't want new players buying a rulebook only to find it's full of stuff they can't buy, or that they used to sell years ago but don't sell anymore because that's confusing or annoying to a newcomer. There also seems to be a policy of line separation. They seem to want all of their games to function as separate product lines independent of each other with as few crossovers as possible. Presumably that's so that they can track which ranges are selling better than others, which is a pretty normal thing for a company to want to do. And of course, all of this stuff is happening within a background now of increasing 3D printing, which has all the same issues as the third-party bit sellers did 10 years ago. 3D printed parts are an amazing thing for modeling, but a huge amount of them are either directly copying Games Workshop artwork or directly copying Games Workshop models. And whatever your opinion is on using those parts, any company would want to crack down on the copyright infringement. Basically, there's a load of considerations other than the game that affect what's going into your rulebooks. Some of them are legal, some of them are an attempt to reduce copyright infringement, some of them are to do with accessibility of new players, some of them are to do with being able to track what your business is doing. Given the most recent releases, as far as I can tell, current policy is as follows. When an official new book is released, that book contains all the units currently sold listed with the options they come with in the model kit, or options that come from other kits but are fully compatible with no converting required, and it seems no mixing of materials. This policy seems to be in line with the Chapter House legal case results, but also part of a desire for new players to have that streamlined experience of the game. So when they buy an army book, every option in it is available from Games Workshop without them needing to learn how to convert, just like the gamers of the late 2000s wanted. If there are units and options that were in the game that Games Workshop produced as model kits in the past, but no longer sell, they're moved into some sort of free PDF format, legends or legacies. I'm not sure of the intent here or why that's legally different for Games Workshop. It might be that they just don't care about people copying those units anymore. It might be that having already produced the models, they feel they're protected in terms of copyright, or it might be something to do with these rules being free and not a sold product. Either way, old units and options get put into the PDF. If a unit is no longer produced, but they plan to reintroduce it in the future, there are a couple of things they do. If it's coming out very, very soon, then they just include it in the rulebook early, and often they preview it around the same time, establishing that this is coming. If it's planned for reintroduction later down the line, the unit gets moved to Legends, and then is reintroduced with an official new mainline datasheet when that kit eventually comes out. So it gets legended temporarily and then moved back. And then finally, there are a load of exceptions based usually on the size of the game and presumably the level of risk involved, as well as the game's target audience and how much removing options would disrupt the player base. So 40k, Age of Sigmar and Kill Team, which are all mainline games with a strong new player focus, tend to be controlled much more rigidly than Necromunda or Old World. Though even the 40k Space Marine Codex still includes units like the Tactical Squad with loads of options that aren't in the model kit, presumably just because so many people have them in their armies, it would be considered too disruptive to change that. And if we look at the recent Horus Heresy 3rd edition release, we can see all those policies in action. Most of the consoles, that's like specialist Space Marine characters, are only available as a resin single pose kit. So those are listed with only the options they're sold with. However, more generic characters like Praetors and Centurions, which have loads of different models, have access to a full page of equipment options like in the old days. That's either just considered easier because there's so many models, or considered too disruptive to change, or it's because there are plastic versions of these units readily available with separate weapons, which technically means that they're compatible with this plastic melee weapons set. That might be the justification for why a Praetor still gets a full set of weapon options and a Librarian doesn't. Across the game, many Legion-specific resin units lost many of their weapon options, but then units like the Palatine Blades, who come with swords, retained their ability to take Phoenix Power Spears, because those are still available in resin and therefore fully compatible. And the new index book includes rules for units that can be created by mixing other existing units, like a Rhino and a Tarantula kit combined to make basically a whirlwind. Again, this doesn't require any conversion, the bits just fit on each other. Legion Breacher squads are a really good example of the more technical end of this. Breachers are Space Marines with boarding shields. In the 2022 edition of the game, the unit was represented by this all-resin kit armed with bolt guns. But you had the option to swap them for Volkite chargers, and there was a resin set of Volkite chargers available for you to buy, so you could do that. However, during the edition, the resin Volkite chargers kit was discontinued, and this plastic special weapon set was released. And the plastic weapons have the hands sculpted on, so they aren't compatible with the old resin models anymore. So in the latest edition, breachers are still in the game, and they're still in the mainline rulebook, and technically, at this point, they're still represented by these resin models, but they don't get their Volkite option. Instead, the Volkite option is moved into a veteran breacher squad in the Legacies PDF. And we know a new plastic breacher squad is going to come out, so these new rules in the book could be preempting what's in that box, or, depending on how long it takes, we might find that there's a new breacher listing that comes out when the box is released. We don't know yet. Horus Heresy does seem to have come under greater restriction than it did in 2022. These rules seem to have been applied more strictly, but we don't know why. It could just be changes in legal policy. It might just be because in 2022, many of these units weren't out yet, and the studio weren't totally sure what would be coming out in the next few years. Or it might just be because Heresy has grown massively, and as a much bigger product line than it was 3 years ago, it's a much bigger liability. Those are all the sort of reasons in play when new editions come out, and we find that options are missing. Generally, when I talk about Games Workshop business practices, I get an awful lot of comments complaining that I'm an apologist, that I should be angrier. But Games Workshop are a multinational publicly traded manufacturing company, and I tend to expect them to act like one. When companies of that scale make decisions about how they're going to operate, there are usually reasons for that. Not only profit, but also reasons of legal cover or copyright protection, or because doing anything at the scale required when the business is that big is a massive logistical undertaking. It is probably easier and requires a lot less investment for you to turn a profit selling bits from your garage than for a multinational company to introduce that as a new aspect of their business. That requires a colossal investment that they might want to spend on some other part of the company. I don't necessarily think all these decisions are the best thing in the short term for every modeler and gamer out there. Having options go away sucks. It affects which models you've built. But there are also reasons why they happen, justifiable reasons that companies do need to keep in mind, and we'd be silly to expect them not to. I also make creative content, both here, but really in my day job, where I have an agent and legal protection in case someone else copies it. I think most people starting a business would. So my general attitude to this is like, pick your battles. One of the downsides of our hobby getting massively more popular is that it's going to operate like a massively bigger company. And also, I should say that I think stuff like the Legends or Legacy system is a really good compromise. It keeps units and options active in the face of various legal considerations. The main reason people dislike Legends in 40k is because they insist on never playing anything other than matched play tournament games. So yeah, that's why your options get removed with every edition, or get displaced, or replaced with something else. It's a long story of copyright infringement, some pretty much failed lawsuits, and extremely conflicting fan demands over about 20 years that have resulted in this really specific set of policies that try and balance legal cover and keeping a customer happy. It's kind of like any enterprise that big, which is why I don't really find it surprising when it happens, and also why I don't tend to join in with the nerd rage when I see it. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like more about the world of Warhammer, well, you can like and subscribe, or there's all the usual things in the description. Join the Patreon to get early videos, join the YouTube membership schemes, or check out the merch on the merch store. See ya.